Don't you know how to mop, or are you just too old to do anything anymore? Kyle's voice cut through the bustling diner like a slap. No one answered. No one spoke up. Everyone just watched or pretended not to see. The mop stopped mid-stroke. The old man's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but because those words cut like shards of broken glass. He didn't look at Kyle. He didn't fight back. He just lowered his head, his eyes still tracing the faint stains on the tile floor, as if they were more important than the shame searing itself into his soul. No one knew his name. They just called him Old George, the old man who mops the floors, the ghost of the late shift. He came early, left late, quietly cleaning every hidden corner, eating a packed lunch in the hallway behind the kitchen, his shoes taped up, a tattered baseball cap, and a frayed red handkerchief in his faded jacket pocket. He was the kind of person society only remembers when someone accidentally spills a drink. The tray in Emma's hand fell with a clatter, a sound that sliced through the room. All conversation ceased. Even the jukebox went silent, as if it knew better. She stepped out from behind the service counter, her voice booming like thunder. "That's enough. No one, I repeat, no one speaks to him like that. While I'm standing here, the entire diner fell silent. Kyle's eyes widened. Whoa. Emma, calm down. I was just joking. Joking. You think insulting someone is a joke? No, that's malice." Kyle let out a dry laugh. "Oh my God, are you defending the floor mopper? He's ancient." Emma lifted her head, not blinking. "He is a human being." She enunciated each word, clear and firm, as if nailing them into the surrounding silence. In a distant corner, the old man, the one she had just stood up for, looked up for the first time. Their eyes met. There was no surprise, no gratitude, but a flash of recognition, as if he had seen her before, or someone like her, as if that act had reawakened something long lost within him, a belief. Then he looked down again, silently, still mopping the floor as if nothing had ever happened. Emma picked up the tray, her hands still shaking. But this time, it wasn't from fear, it was from the anger that was now burning inside her. She didn't regret it. She only regretted not standing up sooner. And then, in that very moment, in the middle of a noisy diner, during a seemingly repetitive and meaningless workday, she had just created a quiet turning point. A turning point that no one here, not even Emma herself, could have imagined. She had just stood up for the man who owned the entire place, because that old man mopping the floor was none other than Richard Nolan, the founder and CEO of the Nolan's Kitchen restaurant chain, who was secretly undercover to investigate the very system he had built. Emma first noticed him during her third week working at Nolan's Kitchen branch number 42 in the suburbs of Dallas. At the time, while quickly wiping down table number 3, she saw from a distance a figure silently scrubbing the wall behind the kitchen, a place no one had asked him to, and no customer would ever see. He always arrived earlier than everyone else, often just as the sky was beginning to lighten. Worn khaki pants, a faded windbreaker, sneakers with scuffed heels, the rubber sole held on with silver-grey duct tape. But what caught Emma's attention wasn't his appearance. It was the way he touched everything gently, carefully, as if every object in this diner held a soul that needed to be respected. Whether it was a plastic chair with a broken leg, an ice cream machine that leaked, or a broom with a worn-out handle, he touched them with the patience of a healer, not just to clean. No one knew where he lived. No one knew his real name. Sometimes they called him Old George, sometimes Ghost. Most didn't call him anything at all, just gave him a task and walked away. Once, while Emma was watching secretly from a distance, she saw him pull a small piece of bread from his jacket pocket and place it next to the dumpster out back, where a stray cat often visited. He didn't shoo it away, nor did he try to coax it. He just put the piece of bread down and walked away, as if the act of giving needed no acknowledgement. Another time, she caught him fixing the leg of a baby-high chair. His fingers moved slowly, as precise as a watchmaker's. The calluses on his hands silently pressed into every wooden corner. Emma wasn't the type to be easily moved. Life had wrung that weakness out of her long ago, but what made her pause wasn't his kindness, but the way he was kind without needing anyone to know. She had tried asking a few people, "What's his real name? I wonder." Everyone shrugged. One of those old janitors, probably a temp. Who cares? And then they would turn away, just like the rest of the world turning its back on the quiet, silent ones. But Emma was different, because she had once been a part of that shadow. Her mother had been a hospital janitor, fired after standing up for a patient. They said she had overstepped her authority. They called her a troublemaker. And that was why Emma saw George through different eyes. There was something in him, in his old-fashioned dedication, and the way he didn't react to condescending looks, that made her see something others didn't. He was a man with a past, and in those silent eyes was a forgotten treasure. It was a slow Wednesday afternoon. No rain, no customers, no music. Emma was serving table number 6 when she heard Kyle's voice echo from the back hallway. "I told you to mop this again. You missed a spot. Do it again." The words were sharp, deliberate. It wasn't a work request. It was a performance, a little play for the few employees loitering near the kitchen. Emma froze. She glanced toward the end of the hallway. George, as usual, was bent over, diligently pushing the mop back and forth. But it was over a tile that was already sparkling clean, clean enough to see your reflection in. Kyle stood with his arms crossed, leaning against a trash can like a petty boss, a half smirk on his lips, holding a cooling plastic cup of coffee. Emma felt something rising in her chest. Not quite anger, but more like an old pain being stirred up. She had witnessed her mother being insulted just like that. She had stayed silent, and she had regretted it ever since. Not this time. Is that what you call working? Someone like you should just retire. Kyle continued, louder. George still didn't respond. He just kept moving the mop patiently, his gaze never lifting. A few other employees snickered. One turned away, pretending to be busy washing a cup. Another one smirked, feigning deafness. Emma set a tray of food down on the counter and walked quickly toward the hallway, each step pounding in time with the rising beat in her chest. "That's enough, Kyle." Her voice rang out. He turned, raising an eyebrow. "Hey now, what's the problem?" I said that's enough. You're humiliating an elderly man in front of everyone." "Are you proud of yourself?" Kyle scoffed. "He's the janitor. I'm just ensuring our hygiene standards." Emma took a step forward. "No, you're playing the bully. And if this is your standard for how to treat people, then maybe you should look at yourself first." A silence fell like a heavy drop of water in the middle of the afternoon. George stopped. He looked up. This time, his gaze wasn't evasive. It wasn't angry. Nor was it grateful. It was understanding. As if he was seeing again someone he once knew. Someone who had stood up just like this. Someone who had been punished for doing the right thing. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment. Then he gave a slight nod, said nothing, and continued his work. Kyle backed away, clearly taken aback by a fierceness he hadn't expected from Emma. "I was just joking." "Relax, girl. No one jokes by insulting others." Emma replied. Kyle looked around. No one was laughing anymore. The small crowd dispersed as quickly as it had formed. When Emma returned to the counter, her heart was still pounding. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze was as steady as steel. She didn't know what consequences her actions would bring. She could be disciplined for causing internal disruption, have her hours cut, be moved to the night shift. But she didn't care, because when she saw George standing there, alone, amidst the taunts, still bowing his head to work without a word of protest, she knew if she didn't speak up today, she would never be able to look at herself in the mirror again. And there was one thing she didn't know, that, in the furthest hidden corner of the kitchen, a security camera was silently recording the entire incident. And a few hours later, that footage would be saved to the internal monitoring system and automatically sent to a single account, the personal account of CEO Richard Nolan. The clock was nearing 10 p.m. The flickering neon lights in the employee break room cast blurry, smudged shadows on the walls. Emma had just finished washing her hands and walked in, her hair down, her shoulders slumped from a shift that had lasted over 12 hours. On the table, a small cup of tea was emitting a gentle steam, a ceramic mug with a chipped rim, still used because it's still drinkable. The man holding it was none other than George, or rather, Richard Nolan. But tonight, he was still in the role of the anonymous janitor. He looked up. The light made him squint slightly. Emma hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but genuine. George smiled. "Me? I should be the one asking you that." Emma sat down across from him. "I'm okay, for the most part. I don't usually react so intensely like I did today." George nodded, gently stirring the tea with one hand, a slow, quiet motion, like still water. "But it seems today was the day you needed to." Emma sighed. "You know, I hate people like Kyle. They laugh at the silence of others and think it's entertainment." George looked at her. "I've seen that type of person my whole life, in school, on the street, and even in the biggest boardrooms." She was slightly taken aback. "Boardrooms? You used to." He paused, then smiled. "A long time ago, before I learned how to mop the floors without anyone noticing." They both laughed, a light and genuine laugh. It was the first time Emma had heard him truly laugh. Not the forced laugh when being given an order, but a laugh that remembered something distant. "Do you have a family?" she asked, then hesitated. "I mean, if it's not too personal." George nodded. "I do. A son, but we don't talk much, and a wife who passed away many years ago." His gaze drifted into the distance through the dusty window, past the darkness of the Texas night. "You remind me of her." Emma tilted her head slightly. Really? She wasn't afraid to stand alone, either. She once lost her job for defending an employee who was wrongfully fired. He took a sip of tea and set the cup down. "That's why I recognized you immediately. Not because of what you said, but because of the way you don't wait for permission to do the right thing." Emma was silent, partly because she was moved, and partly because she never thought she would be understood like this by anyone, especially from someone who seemed invisible in this place. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low. "Emma." "Emma," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You have fire in your eyes. That's more valuable than any skill." She let out a small laugh. "No, what I have in my eyes is the rent." He broke into a full laugh. This time it was complete and warm. "Good. Every fire needs a reason to burn. But not everyone with a reason has the courage to ignite." Emma stood up, about to leave, when she noticed a small red item that had fallen near the table. The old handkerchief faded, frayed at the edges, but carefully folded. She bent down to pick it up. "You dropped this." George glanced at it. "Ah, yes, thank you. But keep it. I have another one." Emma took it, hesitating slightly, then folded it carefully and placed it in her apron pocket. Little did she know that in less than 24 hours, this piece of cloth would become the symbol of a program named after her, spreading across dozens of diners throughout the United States. Night cast its shadow over the parking lot behind the restaurant. The twisted yellow lights cast a dim glow on the faded paint marks and the employees' cars, most of which had been through 2 or 3 owners. In the furthest corner, where no one paid attention, an old silver pickup truck was parked silently. No one knew that the truck was not just a vehicle, but also the mobile office of Richard Nolan, the CEO temporarily living the life of an old man who mopped floors. He sat in the cab, his windbreaker unzipped on one side, his old cap resting on the passenger seat. On his lap was a black leather notebook with worn corners. He switched on a small reading light attached to the ceiling, its soft glow illuminating the words being written in a steady, slow hand. Emma Jacobs, Waitress, Store 42. Action intervened upon witnessing abusive behavior toward an elderly employee. Observation possesses a righteous reflex, no hesitation regardless of consequences. History, never late, no complaints, often helps colleagues switch shifts. Note, leadership potential, reminiscent of core personnel from the startup phase. He put the pen down, closing his eyes for a few seconds. There was something about Emma he couldn't ignore. It wasn't that she stood up, It was that she stood up without knowing anyone was watching. Since Richard began his annual undercover trips, he had met hundreds of employees. Some were talented but calculating. Some were obedient but forgettable. Some talked a good game but performed poorly. But people like Emma, those who act because of something inside them, not for the sake of promotion or because anyone was watching, were as rare as gold in a pile of gravel. He flipped back to an older page in his notebook, a note about an employee at the Ohio branch last year. That person had also defended a kitchen helper who was being mocked for a stutter. That person was now a regional manager. Richard wondered, was Emma ready for the next step? He reached for his tablet, quickly opening the internal HR system. With just a few taps, Emma's personal information appeared. 23 years old, had not graduated from college, employed at Nolan's for 9 months. Temporary address, a small apartment just 4 blocks from the restaurant. No co-signers, no dependents. Except a small note under the next of kin section. Jacob Jacobs, younger brother, high school student. He paused there, his hand slowly tracing the words. This girl wasn't just supporting herself, she was a pillar for someone else. Someone like that doesn't need praise. They need an opportunity. A push at the right time. A door opened from the inside. Richard closed the tablet, folded the notebook, and carefully tucked it into the glove compartment. He leaned back, his eyes gazing up at the ceiling of the truck, where the white light reflected in faint streaks. At 63, he had thought that employees like Emma existed only in his memory. But today, that memory had just walked into real life. In that quiet moment, he whispered, as if to himself, tomorrow, everything starts to change. The next morning, Emma woke up in her small, cramped apartment. Sunlight pierced through the frayed curtains, shining on an old alarm clock that was 5 minutes fast. She sat up, her head feeling a little heavy. Despite being exhausted last night, she had tossed and turned until late, not from fatigue, but because it was strange. There was something about George, or at least the way he looked at her, talked to her, that made her feel she was no longer just a temporary waitress. She felt seen, understood. The feeling was both comforting and frightening. Breakfast was the usual, a slice of burnt-edged toast and a sip of strong but watered-down coffee. Her younger brother, Jacob, slung on his backpack and rushed past the dining table with his usual clipped greeting. "I'm heading to school." Emma nodded. "Stay warm. It's getting chilly." The boy paused for a moment, looked at his sister, and asked with unfamiliar curiosity, "You seem different today." Emma raised an eyebrow. Different how Jacob gave a slight smile. "I don't know. But you seem lighter, like today is going to be a big day." Emma laughed and shook her head. "It's just another day at work for me." But as the door closed behind him, she stood still. Something inside her had also quietly opened, as if her brother's intuition was right. When she walked into Nolan's kitchen at 9:10 a.m., everything was off. Not off with the menu, but with the atmosphere. The cash register light was on. The tables and chairs were in their proper places. The smell of coffee and frying oil still lingered. But there was no music, no laughter, no hushed swearing from the head cook, just a suffocating silence. Emma frowned. Her eyes scanned her colleagues. Lisa, who usually started the morning with a round of gossip, was sitting silently in a chair, avoiding eye contact. Kyle was leaning against the counter, his hands shaking, biting his nails. What had been a contemptuous smirk yesterday had now turned into a pale, tense expression. Greg, the manager, wore a crisper shirt than usual, standing near the entrance with his hands clasped behind his back, breathing heavily as if he had just climbed 3 flights of stairs. No one said anything to her, but they all looked at her, then quickly looked away. She swallowed. This was not normal. And then the door swung open. The bell on the door chimed, but no one looked up. Emma turned around, and her heart skipped a beat. He walked in. Not George. No more tattered shoes. No more faded jacket. No more hat brim pulled down to hide half his face. Before her stood a tall man with neatly combed hair, a charcoal grey blazer, polished leather shoes, and a deep, stern gaze. That face, it was still the face of the old man who mopped the floors. But now it belonged to a completely different person. She felt frozen to the spot. Greg stammered, "Welcome, sir. Can I help you?" The man, now Richard Nolan in the flesh, did not smile, did not nod. He just said softly, "You can help by gathering the entire staff. Immediately." No one dared to breathe loudly. Emma clutched her apron. Questions swirled in her mind, but she couldn't force a single word out of her mouth. The man she had defended was standing tall in the middle of the room with the posture of someone who could command and change the fate of everyone present, and her heart told her something huge was about to happen. The room filled up quickly. All employees were present. They stood in an awkward semicircle in the middle of the dining area, a space usually reserved for customers, now transformed into a place of confrontation. A few people nervously pulled out their phones, then put them away. Everyone understood this wasn't a breakfast meeting. This was a judgment. Emma stood in a corner, her heart pounding like a war drum. Beside her, Kyle was beaded with sweat, his lips pale. Lisa was biting her nails until they bled. Greg, the manager, surreptitiously adjusted his collar for the 3rd time in 30 seconds. The man, no longer George, but Richard Nolan, the founding CEO of Nolan's Kitchen, stood at the center, silent, his back straight. His eyes were sharp, like a man who had seen too many things he didn't want to see. "I founded Nolan's Kitchen nearly 25 years ago," he began, his voice low but carrying clearly. "We started with one wooden table, a loaf of stale bread, and a promise. All eyes were glued to him. No one moved. The promise was this, that if you walk into any of our establishments, whether as a customer or an employee, you will be treated with dignity. Not by job titles, not by age, but with the respect owed to a human being. He paused for a moment, but that promise has faded, and the payrolls, the profit reports, the customer reviews, they don't show me whether it's alive or dead. So, every year, I choose a few locations to visit, not as the chairman, but as an invisible person. He looked around the circle of people. A few employees were starting to understand. Some still couldn't believe it. Last week, I walked into this place as an old janitor. No one recognized me. No one cared. That doesn't matter. What matters is I saw everything. A heavy breath came from Kyle's corner. Lisa swallowed audibly. I saw indifference. I saw contempt. I saw a person treated like trash just because he looked slow and old. And worse, I saw the one insulting him being laughed at, being supported. He turned to look at Kyle. His gaze wasn't angry, but cold, like the scales of justice had just tipped.
Kyle, he said the name clearly. You insulted an elderly employee. You turned it into a spectacle. I don't need to know the reason. I only need to know the nature of it. You are fired, effective immediately. Kyle's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Emma's eyes met his, but she no longer felt resentment. Only emptiness. Lisa, standing nearby, took a half-step back as if to hide. Richard turned to her. Lisa, you didn't start the trouble, but you applauded when someone else was being humiliated. You laughed. You shared the internal video. You are also fired, not for a single act, but for the culture you helped maintain. Lisa didn't cry. Her face flushed. She bit her lip, and then she stepped back like someone who had lost their bearings. The entire room was stunned, but Richard wasn't finished. He turned to Greg, the manager. And you, Greg? The manager froze. You didn't insult anyone, but you did something worse. You saw, and you turned away. His voice wasn't loud, but it was as sharp as a razor. I don't need a manager to keep shifts covered. I need someone to uphold our culture. You are suspended, pending investigation. If it's found that you encouraged or covered this up, your position will be terminated. Greg's face turned pale. I didn't know. You didn't know, but you chose not to want to know. Richard cut him off. Then he paused and turned to Emma. The atmosphere shifted from cold to something warmer, but no less intense. Emma. She looked up. Her hand gripped the red handkerchief in her apron pocket. Her heart seemed to have lost its rhythm. You reminded me why I started all of this. She spoke softly, as if fighting back emotion. I didn't do it for anyone. I just couldn't stay silent. Richard smiled. And that's precisely why you are worthy. He pulled a thin envelope from his jacket, placed it in her hand. This is an invitation to Nolan's Kitchen's Leadership Development Program. Full salary, insurance, senior mentorship, and a new path
Emma opened the letter, staring at the printed words on the paper, her eyes blurring with tears. I don't know what to say." Richard nodded. "You don't need to say anything more. Your actions have already spoken." The room remained silent. Then Richard spoke again, this time louder, for everyone to hear. "Starting today, the entire Nolan's Kitchen system will launch a fund to support employees in hardship. Anyone struggling with bills, illness, loss, will no longer have to fight alone." He looked at Emma. "And we will call it the Emma Fund." A sharp gasp came from the back row. A few people covered their mouths. A single clap was heard. Then more. Then the whole room. Emma was speechless. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time he pulled a familiar object from his inner pocket, the faded red handkerchief. "You returned this to me last night," he said. "Today, I'm returning it to you with a new meaning." Emma took it, her hands trembling slightly. "This isn't just a piece of cloth. It's a reminder. Kindness is a light. And sometimes, just one light is enough to illuminate an entire dark room." Emma stood silently in the middle of the diner, a place that just minutes ago had been the stage for accusations, judgments, and exposed truths. But now, all that remained was an empty space and the scattered applause that was slowly fading. In her hand was the official invitation letter, her name printed on it. The letters neat, the tone formal, and the confirmation clear. "We invite you to join Nolan's Kitchen's Leadership Development Program, a special selection program for personnel nominated by senior management based on outstanding practical action and personal character." She read it twice. Her eyes couldn't believe it. Her fingers still touched the edge of the envelope, as if afraid it would disappear if she let go. Richard was still standing beside her, his gaze no longer stern, but with a strange kind of warmth like a fire after a storm. "I know, this might be a lot to take in at once." Emma let out a soft laugh, but tears still glistened in her eyes. "A lot. I think I'm dreaming." Richard nodded. "If it is a dream, it's a dream created by living right, not by magic." She took a deep breath. "Can I ask, why me?" "I just stood up, because I couldn't stand the way they were treating you. I wasn't thinking about any outcome." "That's exactly why it's you," he answered immediately, without needing to think. "Those who think about outcomes will often calculate, but those who act from a sense of what's right will inspire." Emma paused, then nodded slowly. She turned to look at the kitchen where the smell of grease still lingered. She looked at table number 6 where it all began. She looked at her apron, where the old red handkerchief lay neatly in her pocket. She remembered her mother, who had lost her job just for speaking up for a colleague, who had once said something that was deeply etched in her memory. "If one day you see something wrong and your heart remains silent, then you are no longer yourself." And yesterday, her heart had spoken, without a plan, without an audience. Today, that voice became the stepping stone to a path she had never dared to imagine. Richard stepped aside, giving a slight gesture. "I'll let you think about it, but only for 24 hours. If you're ready, the program starts next Monday. Transportation and accommodation have been arranged." Emma looked at him, then at the envelope, then at herself in the small mirror near the service counter. She saw a young woman, her eyes still red, her hair slightly messy, her hands still trembling, but in her eyes there was something very steady. "I'll join," she said, without hesitation. Richard smiled, not the smile of a boss, but of a teacher who had just seen his student choose the right path. "Good," he said, "because this world needs more Emmas." Emma nodded. She didn't know what awaited her. She wasn't sure if she was good enough, talented enough, or brave enough. But there was one thing she knew. She had already done the hardest part. She had spoken up. The rest was just learning how to take the next step. The makeshift meeting room at Nolan's Kitchen, Branch 42, was no longer filled with tension. It was the same people in the same uniforms, with the same roles, but their expressions and gazes had changed. No more Kyle, no more Lisa, and Greg had retreated to his office, awaiting the results of the internal investigation. In the center of the hall stood Richard Nolan, no longer Old George, but the CEO, announcing a systemic change. "I know," he said, "that none of you came here today to hear a speech, but I need you to hear this." His voice was steady, not the rah-rah tone of a commercial, but the voice of a man who had been through enough failures to understand that change begins with trust. "I used to think that kindness was a personal matter, that kind people would just live kindly, but I was wrong." The room held its breath. Kindness, if not protected, nurtured, and recognized, will gradually be suffocated by indifference and fear. He raised his hand, holding up a document. On it was a bolded title, "The Emma Fund, Employee Support Initiative." All eyes focused on it. Emma felt rooted to the spot. Starting today, all 87 branches of Nolan's Kitchen will have an internal support fund for those facing hardship from illness, accidents, to financial or family crises. A soft murmur rose from the back. A female employee wiped her eyes. The old cook nodded repeatedly. A young dishwasher muttered, "I can't believe it. Someone's finally doing this for real." "And?" Richard paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on Emma. "I want everyone to remember the name of the person who made this possible. A person with no title, no special privileges. Only one thing, the courage to speak up." He turned to her, holding the document high. "This fund will bear your name. It will be called the Emma Fund." All sound seemed to stop. Emma's eyes widened. "No, I don't. I don't deserve that." Richard just smiled gently. "I know you think that. That's why you deserve it." He stepped closer, taking from his inner pocket a familiar object, the faded red handkerchief now carefully pressed and resting in a small mahogany box. "You returned this to me last night. But today..." He opened the box. I want to give it back to you, this time with meaning." Emma reached out to take it. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from an emotion so deep she was speechless. This handkerchief used to be just a cloth to wipe away sweat, but now it will remind us that no act of kindness is too small, and sometimes an entire system is changed because one person decided not to bow their head. Applause erupted, first from one person, then two, then the entire room. The atmosphere broke, not because of a management decision, but because of proof that someone at the top was truly listening, truly seeing, and truly acting. Emma stood there, clutching the handkerchief to her chest. She didn't know what would happen when she walked into the executive office next week. She didn't know if she would succeed. But there was one thing she knew for sure. From this day on, no one would call her the waitress at table 6 anymore. She was Emma, and her name would be a sanctuary for hundreds of others. The meeting ended. The employees left the room one by one, but no one was in a hurry like on a normal day. They walked slowly, many stopping to pat Emma lightly on the shoulder, some bowing their heads in thanks, some just looking at her with a silent gaze, the gaze of those who had once been silent but were now awakened. The room was left with just two people, Emma and Richard. She was still standing there, one hand clutching the red handkerchief, the other holding the life-changing invitation letter. "Where do I start?" she asked, her eyes looking down, her voice real and trembling. Richard answered slowly, his eyes looking straight at her like a predecessor passing on the torch. "Start with what you've already done. You saw something wrong. You spoke up. You acted when you had no support. The rest is just learning other people's names and reading a few procedures." She smiled, the first real smile of the day. "So I'm qualified?" He nodded. "You're not just qualified, Emma. You are a reminder to all of us that when everything seems to be just silence, there's always someone brave enough to break it." Emma looked around the restaurant one more time. Still the smell of coffee mixed with frying oil. Still the old tables and chairs. Still the cash register making its short beeping sound. But everything was different. Not because of the people who left, but because of the person who dared to stay and speak up. She said softly, as if asking herself, "Will I really make a difference?" Richard smiled this time, a smile full of trust. "You already have. You just haven't seen how big it is yet." She nodded, gently, but firmly, then turned to leave. Outside, the gentle midday sun fell on the street, shining through the glass window and making the red handkerchief in her hand glow like a small flame. Emma paused at the door, taking a deep breath. In her pocket was a ticket to the future. But in her heart was something more precious, a promise that she would never stay silent, even when everyone else turned away. Not just for George, not just for herself, but for all those who had ever been looked down upon, ever been forgotten, ever thought they were invisible. Today, Emma left the diner not as an employee, but as the seed of a new wave, a wave of justice, of compassion, of a kindness that needs no name but can rewrite the entire culture of a system. If you ever think that one small act can't change anything, remember Emma, the person with no power, no status, only a heart strong enough to say, "That's enough." And sometimes, that is the only thing this world needs.